70,000 soldiers died in one single day, and the sky above the battlefield seemed to cry with them, filled with dark smoke, burning air, and the sound of never-ending gunfire. But none of it started with the roar of war. It started with quiet planning in closed rooms, where powerful men with clean hands made deadly choices for those who would never return home. And in the early morning of February 21st, 1916, in the small, quiet land around Verdun in France, thousands of French soldiers stood inside muddy trenches, tired, cold, and scared, holding rifles in their hands, not knowing that this day would become the deadliest day in all of human history, while on the other side, German troops prepared their weapons with calm focus, ready to follow orders that would soon turn peaceful ground into a river of blood. And when the attack began, it was like the earth itself had exploded, with over 1,200 cannons firing non-stop for hours, shaking the ground so violently that trees fell, trenches collapsed, and men covered their ears in terror, unable to believe they were still alive, while thick smoke made it impossible to see, and the only thing they could hear were the screams of wounded friends and the deep thunder of explosions that never stopped. And as the German army moved forward through the ruins, firing machine guns and throwing grenades, French soldiers tried to fight back. But many were too shocked or injured to move, and in the middle of that chaos, a young French soldier named Émile, only 18 years old, crawled across the broken ground to find his brother Luc, who had gone missing when their trench was hit by a shell. And as Émile searched, his hands shaking and his uniform covered in mud and blood, he saw so many lifeless bodies that he could no longer tell who was friend or enemy. Only faces frozen in fear, eyes open, mouths silent. And when he finally found Luc, crushed under the wooden frame of a destroyed trench wall, Émile screamed a sound so full of pain that even the nearby soldiers paused for a moment, and though he tried to pull his brother out, Lutz's body was too still, too cold. And Émile understood then that he was truly alone, just like thousands of others around him and far away. The generals looked at maps with red lines and thought only of land, territory, and victory, not of the boys who were bleeding in the dirt. And all across the battlefield, horses ran without riders. Stretchers broke under the weight of too many injured, and nurses cried as they ran out of bandages, while the rivers near Verdun turned dark red with blood, and the wounded crawled through dead bodies just to find water. And the gas silent and deadly crept across the ground like a ghost, making men cough until they choked, and all Émile could do was sit beside his brother's body, covering his face with trembling hands, whispering prayers that were lost in the sound of more gunfire, more death, more screams. And as night fell, the world felt empty, as if God himself had turned away. And by the time the moon rose, 70,000 men were dead, and the land where they fell would never be the same again. A place where war had changed forever, where honor died with the soldiers and machines replaced courage, and all that remained was a silence so heavy that even the wind refused to blow across the destroyed land, where broken helmets, torn letters, half-buried rifles, and pieces of uniforms lay scattered like forgotten pieces of lives that would never be remembered fully. And as Émile sat beside his brother's cold body, too numb to cry, the sky above turned darker with clouds that seemed to carry the weight of all the souls lost that day. And in the far distance, the German troops had begun digging into the same kind of muddy trenches they had just attacked, setting up more barbed wire, more guns, more guards, as if this place where 70,000 men had just died was only the beginning of something even worse. And as night turned into another cold, gray morning, the battle did not stop, it grew. And the land of Verdun became a place where men were sent not to fight, but to survive just one more day. And the French soldiers who were still alive barely had time to eat or sleep before the sound of more shells filled the air, shaking their bones and minds again. And inside one small underground dugout, Emile was forced to leave his brother behind and join other soldiers in defending the trench. And none of them spoke much anymore, their eyes hollow from what they had seen, and they all knew that death could come from anywhere: a sniper's bullet, a collapsing wall, a poison gas cloud, or simply from being in the wrong place at the wrong second, and food became rare, water turned dirty, and boots filled with blood and freezing water as the soldiers stood in the mud for hours. Their hands too cold to hold their weapons properly, but they stayed, because orders said they must, because their country said they had to, because if they left, someone else would have to die in their place, and the German army, thinking that French would break and run, kept attacking with wave after wave, sending more soldiers, more shells, more gas, and yet the French lines held, not because of hope or bravery, but because there was nowhere left to go, and even when medical supplies ran out and wounded men lay crying for help that would never come. The commander simply ordered more reinforcements, more weapons, more people into the grinder, and Emile watched men younger than him walk into the same hell he had survived only by chance, and each one came back less human, less alive, even. If their hearts still beat, and at night, the trench smelled of rot, smoke, wet clothes, and silent fear. And every time a new letter arrived from home, it reminded the soldiers of the world that still existed beyond the battlefield, a world they felt drifting further away with each shell that landed near them, and in one corner of the trench, a soldier named Julian kept drawing pictures of trees and lakes in his notebook, shaking hands trying to remember the shapes of peace, while another, named Henry, refused to speak anymore after seeing 3 of his friends disappear under a bomb. And Emile, who had once loved books and music, now only sat quietly, his eyes staring at the mud, his thoughts filled with the sound of his brother's last breath. And the longer the battle went on, the more it felt like the war was no longer between 2 countries. It was a war between life and death itself, a war that did not care for uniforms or borders, and every part of the land began to change. The green trees now black skeletons, rivers now slow-moving veins of blood, and animals that once ran freely now lay silent in the dirt beside the men, as if even nature could no longer survive what humans had brought. And still the guns kept firing, and still the orders kept coming. And every time the sun rose, it felt colder than the night before, not in temperature, but in feeling, in the way the light touched a place that no longer welcomed warmth. And the name Verdun began to spread across both France and Germany like a dark whisper, a symbol not of victory but of endless suffering, and mothers began to receive letters that only said missing, not knowing that their sons had disappeared into a hole so deep that not even memory could pull them out. And while some commanders celebrated holding the line or capturing a few meters of ground, the men inside those meters wondered if it was worth even one more drop of blood. And the battle that had started as a bold move to break enemy lines had now turned into a nightmare with no clear goal, no clear end, just day after day of rain, fear, noise, hunger, pain, and the heavy silence that followed each explosion. And Emile, who now no longer believed the war would end soon, began writing a diary in the dark, using the back of old letters he had found in fallen soldiers' pockets, trying to keep his mind from breaking, trying to remember his mother's voice, his brother's laughter, and the feeling of wind on a hill that wasn't filled with smoke. And each word he wrote felt like a small fight against the madness, a way to say, I am still alive, even if the world around him was dying. More every hour, and on the 14th day, as the cannon screamed again and a fresh gas attack turned the trench into a green fog of choking air, Emile tied the diary to his leg with a torn piece of cloth, crawled toward the surface with his rifle shaking in his hands, and prepared once again to face a storm that cared nothing for names, faces, or hearts, only for numbers, only for bodies, only for more death. Death had become so common in Verdun that soldiers stopped counting it, stopped reacting to it, as if it were just another shadow that walked among them. And when Emil stepped into the open trench again, his face burned from the gas, his legs shaking, and the sound of his own heartbeat louder than the gunfire. He could feel that he was no longer the boy who had arrived here 2 weeks ago. He had turned into something else, someone quieter, harder, more afraid of silence than of bullets, because silence meant someone nearby had just died. And as the green gas began to clear slowly, revealing more lifeless bodies with eyes open toward the sky, Emil crawled forward, searching for anyone still breathing, and found a young soldier lying face down. Groaning softly, his back burned badly from the chemicals. And without thinking, Emil pulled him by the arms and dragged him into a shallow hole where the air was thinner, covering both of them with a muddy tarp as more shells screamed overhead. And the boy's name was Thomas, only 16, who had lied about his age to join the army, thinking war was full of honor and flags, but now his voice shook as he whispered, "Will I die here?" And Emil didn't answer because he didn't know anymore what living or dying meant in a place where both happened every second. And as the battle raged on outside their small hiding spot, they stayed still, breathing slowly, waiting for the world to calm, and when it finally did, they came out into a field that looked more like the surface of another planet. Craters everywhere. No grass, no color, only gray mud, broken wood, twisted metal, and arms sticking out of the ground like roots from a tree of death. And together they tried to walk, supporting each other, back toward what remained of their trench, only to find it had collapsed under a new round of shelling, burying 3 of their closest comrades, whose names were never recorded, whose faces were already fading from memory. And as they sat beside the crushed wall of what used to be shelter, Emil took out a small piece of bread he had saved from 2 days ago and gave half to Thomas, who cried while eating it, not because of hunger, but because it reminded him of home, of his mother, of peace. And in that moment, Emil realized something strange, that even in the middle of war, small kindness could survive, and he held on to that thought like a lifeline, because everything else was falling apart, including his own hope. And every night now, the survivors in the trench would write short messages to their families, not knowing if they would ever be sent, and some would cry while writing, while others stayed silent, because they had lost so much that they no longer believed in words. And more gas came the next day, this time mixed with fire. A new German weapon that burned flesh even in underground bunkers, and screams filled the battlefield again, men rolling on the ground with their clothes on fire. And Emil saw a soldier named Andre run straight into a burning trench to pull out 2 wounded men, only to be hit by a sniper as he climbed out, and his body fell into the flames without a sound. And no one could save him, and still the orders came, "Hold the line, do not fall back, defend the fort." As if those words meant anything to the half-broken humans standing in mud that reached their knees. And every hour more reinforcements arrived, boys with clean faces and nervous eyes who thought they would be heroes, but within a day looked like ghosts, staring blankly, their boots soaked, their dreams shattered. And as Emil watched a group of them being led into a trench already marked for shelling, he wanted to scream, to stop them, to say, "Don't go, it's already dead there." But his voice wouldn't come, and so he just watched. And minutes later the sky tore open again, and when it cleared, only smoke remained. And he knew they were gone too, and every foot of ground gained was bought with 100 lives, every small victory soaked in screams and blood. And even though the commanders spoke of courage and duty, none of them came to the front lines to see what those words truly cost. And by the 3rd week, Emil could no longer smell anything but burning, no longer feel his toes inside his boots, and when he touched his face, it felt like someone else's skin, cracked and cold. And Thomas, now barely able to speak from his injured throat, would sometimes whisper songs from childhood, trying to remember how it felt to be safe, while Emil kept writing in his hidden diary. Page after page of broken thoughts, names of fallen friends, questions to God, and promises to himself that if he lived, he would never forget this place, never stop telling the truth about what had happened here, because Verdun was no longer a town or a front or a military goal. It was a graveyard without end, a place where death was louder than guns, and time itself seemed to have stopped, and even as snow began to fall, covering the bodies with a blanket of white, trying to hide the horror, Emil knew that beneath it all, the war was still alive, still hungry, still waiting to take more. More lives, more blood, more names that would never be remembered, because as the snow melted under fire and footsteps, it revealed bodies buried just days earlier, now frozen in the mud with open eyes and stretched hands, as if still begging for something, help, forgiveness, peace, no one could tell. And Emil walked past them silently, each one another reminder that he too might end like this, faceless in the cold, forgotten by history, and the worst part was that the battle still had no clear end, because the German army had planned to crush the French spirit by bleeding it slowly. And the French army, proud and desperate, refused to give up even an inch of land, turning the ground itself into a war of pride, not strategy. And each side kept sending more soldiers, more weapons, more suffering, and even the birds stopped flying over Verdun, perhaps sensing that the sky above this battlefield was cursed, poisoned by screams and fire. And every letter Emil received from his mother became harder to read because her words were filled with worry, asking, "Are you safe? Are you eating? When will you come home?" And he would stare at the page for hours before replying with lies. "Yes, I'm fine. I'll be home soon." Even though deep inside he wasn't sure if he would live to see another week. And every time he picked up a pen, his hands shook from cold and fear, because even in the moments of silence, the ground would suddenly shake again, a reminder that peace was never real here. And when Thomas died from infection 2 days after his wounds reopened, Emil didn't cry, didn't speak. He just sat beside the boy's body for a few hours, watching the snow fall again, and then buried him quietly using a broken shovel and the top of a wooden crate marked ammunition, writing Thomas's name on a piece of cloth and tying it to a stick so at least someone someday might know he had lived. And every action like that felt more sacred than any battle order, because in a world where life meant nothing to those in power, the only resistance left was to remember the faces, the stories, the voices that the war wanted to erase. And the deeper into the months the battle went, the stranger the soldiers became, as if the war had started to live inside them, changing their eyes, their smiles, their sleep. And Emil began to see men talking to ghosts, laughing at nothing, singing songs in the middle of shell fire, not out of courage, but because their minds were slowly falling apart. And medical tents overflowed not just with wounded bodies, but with broken minds, and doctors no longer asked what hurt. They only asked if a soldier could still stand and fire a rifle, and if the answer was yes, they were sent back into the storm, and if not, they were left aside, sometimes to recover, sometimes to disappear. And Emil once saw a man shoot himself in the leg just to escape the trench, only to be court-martialed and taken away by officers who called him a coward. Even though everyone knew he was just tired of watching his friends die one by one. And it made Emil wonder what counted as bravery now facing the bombs or refusing to become a part of them. And every time he saw a new wave of reinforcements arrive, boys who barely had beards, their shoes too clean, their eyes still wide, he felt like screaming, because they had no idea what was waiting ahead, and most of them would be gone before they even learned their commander's name. And while some still believed in medals and duty, Emil believed only in surviving, in saving just one more life, in writing one more page of his diary, because if the war would not stop, then at least his truth would live somewhere. And he wrote about the faces he saw, the hands that held his, the voices that whispered goodbyes in the mud, and one night, when the trench was quiet except for distant shelling, he wrote about Luke, his brother, not as a soldier, but as the boy who made kites, who played the violin, who once cried when their dog died, and as he wrote, tears finally came, falling silently down his cheeks, mixing with dirt, making tracks on a face that had forgotten how to feel, and when he finished, he folded the paper, put it in a small tin box, and buried it under a rock near the corner of the trench. Endure because there was no other choice, and each sunrise didn't bring hope anymore, it brought more orders. More sound of trucks arriving with crates of bullets and crates of boys who didn't yet understand that every step forward might be their last, and Emil, whose face had lost its softness, whose voice now spoke slower, whose hands always trembled slightly, kept moving through the frozen trench lines, past the bodies no one had time to bury, past the broken walls covered in frost, past the letters half torn and soaked in mud, and deep in his heart he knew that if he ever left this place, he would never again be the same person who had first arrived full of pride and belief in duty. And around him the winter continued its silent war snow falling gently over machine guns, icicles hanging from shattered helmets, rats crawling over boots that no longer moved. And in those long silent hours between shell attacks, the men told fewer stories, shared fewer memories, spoke less and less, because the war had taken not just their strength but their words too. And in one dugout, Emil found a soldier sitting beside a candle, holding a photograph to his chest, eyes closed, lips moving in prayer, but when he touched his shoulder to speak, the soldier fell sideways. He had been dead for hours, holding on to the last piece of his old life as if his soul had refused to leave until someone noticed. And Emil covered his body with a coat, placed the photo in his pocket, and marked the wall with the soldier's name in charcoal so that at least someone might know he had lived and loved. And in that moment, Emil realized that memory had become the most valuable thing they had left, more than bullets, more than food, even more than hope. Because when everything around them was being destroyed, memory was the only thing that made them human, and so he kept writing in his diary names, dreams, things he wanted to say to his mother, questions for God that had no answers, and each page became heavier, soaked in pain, but also in a kind of strength, the strength of truth. And outside the trench, the war raged on with new weapons, new strategies, flamethrowers that turned hiding places into tombs, gas shells that silenced entire units before they could even scream, and airplanes that dropped bombs from above, breaking the sky the way. The artillery broke the earth, and yet despite it all, the line at Verdun did not fall, and the generals far away in warm rooms sent telegrams of praise, calling it bravery, calling it glory, calling it honor. But for the men on the ground, there was no honor in holding a line made of corpses, no glory in standing knee-deep in the remains of friends, no victory in counting days by how many fewer. Names were spoken at roll call, and Emil knew that the world would never truly understand what had happened here, that the news back home could not capture the way a man looked after pulling his best friend's body from under a collapsed wall, or the way the air tasted after a gas attack like acid and rust, or how cold the silence felt after 20 hours of shell fire, like standing on the moon, and still they fought not for medals, not for countries, but because stopping meant dying, because somewhere behind them were towns and villages and families who still believed in the cause. And even if the cause had lost meaning here, they fought so that others might never see what they had seen, and one day in March, after weeks of endless fighting, Emil was chosen for a scouting mission he and 2 others had to cross open ground during the night to gather information about a German gun placement. And as they crawled through no man's land, the world around them felt like a nightmare barbed wire twisting like thorns. Shattered trees standing like ghosts, bodies half buried with frozen hands reaching up from the dirt, and the ground itself felt alive with the memory of every death. And when they reached the edge of the enemy trench, they lay still for hours, listening, counting the men, marking the weapons, until finally, as they turned to leave, a flare shot into the sky, lighting the night like day, and bullets ripped through the darkness, hitting one of the scouts in the chest, sending him spinning backwards into the mud. And Emil pulled the other survivor down behind a rock, heart pounding, vision spinning, as machine guns searched the field with fire. And they stayed like that until the darkness returned, crawling back slowly, breath by breath, inch by inch, dragging the wounded man with them, even though he was already gone, refusing to leave him behind. And by the time they reached the trench again, the sun was rising and Emil collapsed from him. Exhaustion, his body shaking, his fingers cut and bleeding, his ears ringing with the sound of gunfire that wouldn't stop even in his dreams. And later, when he finally woke, the captain told him the mission was a success, that they had learned something useful, and Emil nodded, but inside he felt empty, because what had they really gained? Another body, another page in the diary, another scar on a soul that had already been torn to pieces, and all around him. The war continued, hour after hour, day after day, and even though spring had begun, no flowers grew in Verdun, only more graves. Graves that had no names, no crosses, no goodbyes, only muddy mounds with torn boots or rusted helmets left behind like silent screams frozen in time. And as Emil walked past them each morning during his rounds, it felt like he was walking through a forgotten city made of death, where the streets were trenches and the buildings were broken bones. And even though the air grew warmer with spring, the cold inside their hearts never left, because Verdun had changed them forever. And now every laugh felt like a lie, every meal like a crime, every breath like a gift stolen from someone else. And when new soldiers arrived young, clean, full of questions, Emil barely spoke to them because he couldn't bear to learn new names only to lose them within days. And he had grown tired of promises, tired of letters that never came, tired of pretending this would end soon. And so he focused on small tasks, cleaning his rifle, sharpening a knife, folding the bandages in the medical supply box, because doing something, anything, helped him not think about the silence that followed after every explosion, the silence that now filled his dreams more than the sound of war. And in the far-off command posts, generals debated about land and numbers, about honor and defense, but in the trenches none of that mattered. Because they weren't fighting for territory anymore, they were just fighting to live, to make it through one more sunrise, one more night without being buried alive or blown apart. And one morning Emil was sent to help a wounded runner who had collapsed halfway between the forward trench and the headquarters. And as he carried the boy on his back, slipping through the same mud where many others had fallen, he saw the boy was barely breathing, with a hole in his stomach and blood soaking his coat, but still whispering his message, still trying to deliver the words entrusted to him. And Emil didn't know why that broke him more than anything else he had seen. But as he dropped the boy in the medical tent and watched the nurse shake her head slowly, he felt something crack inside, something that could not be repaired. And for the first time in days, he sat alone in the corner of the trench and wept. Without holding back, wept not just for the boy, but for everything they had lost. The brothers, the friends, the peace, the future. And even though no one said anything, a few soldiers sat near him, quietly, offering a piece of bread, a blanket, a nod. Because in that place, sometimes the only language left was presence. And over the next few weeks, the battle grew even worse, with a new German push that used flamethrowers and heavy artillery to destroy entire lines in hours. And Emil watched as the trench he had helped build with his own hands was swallowed by fire, its wooden walls turning black, its sandbags exploding, its watchpost collapsing into a pile of ash, and still the commanders sent new orders to hold, to push back, to never retreat, and so they fought in the ruins with bayonets and fists and anything they could find until their fingers bled and their lungs burned, and as the days blurred into nights and the wounded became more than the healthy, Emil found himself talking less and writing more, filling his diary with names not of soldiers, but of small things he remembered: his father's smile when fixing the roof, the smell of fresh bread from his village bakery, the way his brother used to hum when nervous, because holding on to those memories felt like lighting a candle in a cave filled with darkness. And the more he remembered, the more human he stayed, while others slowly slipped into silence, staring at nothing, speaking to no one, walking like ghosts through the narrow trenches. And one night, as the stars tried to shine through smoke-filled skies, Emil saw a young German soldier running toward them with no weapon, waving his arms, screaming something in broken French, and though some aimed their rifles, Emil shouted, "Stop!" and ran toward him, and the boy collapsed into his arms, shaking, crying, blood running down his forehead, saying his entire unit had been wiped out by friendly fire and he didn't want to fight anymore. And Emil looked at the others and saw, not enemies in their eyes, but tired souls too weary to hate. On without ever truly understanding what had happened in those months at Verdun, because outside the battlefield, people still went to markets, drank tea in cafes, read newspapers with maps and numbers, but those numbers could never show what it felt like to carry a friend's body through mud while shells burst overhead, or to see a trench full of laughing boys one day and walk past it silent and empty the next. And Emil, though still breathing, no longer felt fully alive, because a part of him had been buried in every crater, every collapsed tunnel, every blood-soaked wall. And even though the French High Command called Verdun a victory, the men who survived it knew better. It was not victory. It was survival through pain too deep to name. And now, as fresh troops slowly replaced the exhausted, injured ones, Emil was finally given leave, a short rest away from the front lines, and when he stepped onto the train heading away from Verdun, he looked out the window and saw the broken land stretching behind him like a wound never heal, and as the train moved forward, he noticed how quiet the world outside the war was: fields untouched, birds flying, flowers blooming, and it felt strange, wrong almost, as if he no longer belonged in that world, as if the silence was too soft after so many months of screaming. And when he reached his village, his mother cried so hard she couldn't speak, just held him, touched his face again and again like making sure he was real. And neighbors came by, whispering words like brave and hero. But Emil didn't feel like either, because how could he be a hero when so many better men never came home? And he walked through the village slowly, noticing how everything looked smaller now: the bakery, the school, the river where he used to swim, and he visited Lutz's grave, a simple stone with his name, though Emil knew the real grave was still somewhere in Verdun, under that sky full of smoke and silence, and he placed a small note there, one he had written months ago, a goodbye he never got to say. And when he returned home, he opened his bag and took out the diary, placing it in a wooden box under his bed, not because he wanted to forget, but because it was too heavy to read just yet. And for days he sat in his room, staring out the window, listening to the wind, flinching at every sudden noise, dreaming of gas masks in trenches. And slowly, piece by piece, he began to talk again to his mother, to the neighbors, to the children who asked what war was like, and he told them not stories of medals or flags, but of people, of Julian who drew lakes in his notebook, of Thomas who hummed songs before sleeping, of Lucas who cried in a different language but with the same pain. And as he spoke, Something inside him began to heal. Not quickly, not fully, but like a broken branch learning how to hold sunlight again, and he wrote letters to the families of fallen soldiers describing how their sons smiled, what their last words were, how they were not alone when they died. And each letter felt like planting a flower on a grave far away, something small, but alive, and in time he returned to Verdun, not as a soldier, but as a witness walking through the rebuilt roads, past the new memorials, past the signs that told part of the story but not all of it, because only those who had been there truly knew how deep the scars ran. And Emil knelt in one quiet field where he had once hidden under fire, placed 3 stones in a line, and whispered the names of those he remembered, because he knew memory was the only thing that could fight the forgetting. And when he stood again, the wind touched his face gently, not with smoke or dust, but with something close to peace. And though he knew many would never understand, and that wars would come again, he promised himself to keep telling the truth, not of numbers or generals, but of the boys who sang under the stars, the men who held each other's hands in fear, the moments of kindness in the middle of hell. And as he walked back through the trees, now green again, he realized that though war had taken much from him, it could not take everything, and somewhere inside the story, beneath the pain and silence, there was still life. Life, fragile and quiet, yet stronger than all the bombs and bullets that had tried to crush it, slowly found its way back into the ruins that once echoed with screams, and years later, the battlefield of Verdun, once soaked with the blood of 70,000 souls in a single day, had become still, covered in grass, visited by school children and tourists who walked the trails with cameras and guidebooks, reading plaques that spoke of bravery and sacrifice, but not always of fear, not always of loneliness, not always of the way the earth used to shake beneath young soldiers' boots, or how the night sky would glow red as villages burned. And Emil, now older, his hair gray, his back bent slightly from time and memories, returned one last time to the place where his youth had died, wearing a coat that once belonged to Luke, and carrying with him a small wooden box, the same box where he had kept the diary, now wrapped in cloth, worn with age, but still holding every word, every name, every moment. And he walked slowly to the same spot where he had buried Lucas's name beneath the rocks, where Thomas had smiled through pain, where Julian had once sketched a tree on a page torn from a ration book. And he knelt down, dug carefully with his hands, and placed the diary there, pressing the dirt gently over it like tucking in a child to sleep. And he whispered a final promise, not to the war, but to the truth, that someone someday would dig up these pages and learn not just what happened, but how it felt, and that maybe then the world would understand that war is never glory. It is never flags waving under blue skies. It is mud and silence, lost letters and unanswered prayers, and the echo of voices calling out for mothers in their last breath. And as he stood up, wiping his hands, he looked at the trees now grown tall, and the wind now gentle, and the graves now marked with names and dates, and he knew that peace had returned to this place. But it had come too late for those it was meant to save, and as he turned to leave, he passed by a group of young visitors gathered near the memorial, listening to a guide explain how the French line had held, how the German attack had failed, how Verdun had been a turning point in the war. But Emil paused, knowing that none of those words told the full story, and when one of the children looked at him and asked, "Were you here?" he simply nodded, placed a hand on the boy's shoulder, and said, "Remember the names," before walking away slowly, his figure fading into the trees like a shadow of history itself. Because even after all those years, the smell of smoke still lingered faintly in the soil, and every gust of wind carried whispers if one listened closely enough, not of soldiers or nations or borders, but of boys who never grew old, of promises left unfinished, of stories buried in places where the grass grows wild, and as the sun Dipped below the hills of Verdun and shadows stretched across the land, it was clear that even though the guns had long gone silent, one question still hung in the air like an unanswered echo. What if the world had listened before it was too late?